The Brits had a messy road to constitutionality. You should really write this chart down because it'll help you understand all these events. So we start off with the Stuarts, who are going to take the throne after Elizabeth. So we start with James the First and Charles the First. And then there's going to be the English Civil War between Charles the First forces and Cromwell's forces. And Cromwell's going to win. He's not a king, but he's going to have what's called the Commonwealth. But Cromwell messes it all up, and we get the Restoration. The Restoration means the Stuarts go back on the throne, and then Charles II and James II rule. But there's still problems in England, and so they make an agreement with relatives named Mary and her husband William, and we have what's called the Glorious Revolution. Some of you may be wondering if I actually expect you to know all those English rulers in order, and the answer is yes, but hopefully this diagram will help you. One of my students came up with this idea, and it's basically that this time period in English history is kind of like a hamburger. If you consider the two pieces of bread, the Stuart family, and the middle is the Cromwells, and at the bottom where William and Mary are, that's like the plate that it's all sitting on. Another way to look at this is kind of like a mirror. So like Cromwell is the mirror reflecting to the bottom half of the Stuarts from the top half. So in other words, it goes from James to Charles and then reflected back as Charles then James. Whichever one helps you. This whole thing starts with taxes. The king, and in this case King James, wanted to increase taxes, but the parliament, because the British have a parliament, didn't want this, but the parliament didn't have a lot of power. Another thing going on at the same time is that there was a movement in England that the Catholic Church that had been kicked out by Henry VIII created the Anglican Church, but it still basically was like the Catholic Church just without the Pope. And there were people in England who wanted to go farther with this. They took ideas of John Calvin, and they wanted to purify the Anglican Church. And from the word purify, we get Puritans. These Puritans gained a lot of seats in the Parliament, and so this made the tension even higher in England. And this tension continues from James I to Charles I. And the tension between the Puritans and Parliament and Charles I gets so intense that they actually go to war, and that's what's called the English Civil War. On one side were the people in Parliament who were mostly Puritans, and they called themselves the Roundheads. And then there was Charles's army that was called the Cavaliers. And the reason the Roundheads were called Roundheads is because they had stupid haircuts. Later on, you'll see a short video and you'll see the guy with the funny kind of pilgrimy kind of haircut. So that's why they're called Roundheads. In the end of the war, the Roundheads win. And not only do they beat Charles's army, they execute him. They chop off his head. So this slide is going to show you the lead up to the Glorious Revolution and what the Glorious Revolution is. So on the last slide, we talked about that the Puritans had won, the Roundheads had won the war. And so they create what they call the Commonwealth. And Oliver Cromwell is at the head of this Commonwealth. And because it's run by Puritans, they start doing things that English people don't like. They start banning things like sports and celebrating Christmas. And they close all the pubs in England. And I think actually that's probably the most important one. Can you imagine England with no drinking? It just didn't make sense to the average Englishman, all these things being banned. And eventually they kick out Cromwell and ask for the Stuart family to come back. And the first Stuart to come back is Charles II. And that's called the Restoration. Right now I'm going to stop this video for a second, or you should press pause, and then on the playlist click the next video. It's kind of a silly little video. It starts with someone going to visit Cromwell to celebrate Christmas, and you should notice the haircut and some of the other things he bans. And then the second part of the video is bringing back Charles, and he sings you a little song. You should sort of note some of the things that he brings back. All right, you should pause the video now. All right, welcome back. So after Cromwell was Charles II, as you saw in the video. And besides bringing back all the things that the Puritans had banned, he continued to behave like a king and used a lot of money to build armies and other things. And so this issue of taxes was still there, even though the English people had wanted the Stuarts to return. And then comes James II, and still this policy of taxes and the king having more power than the people in Parliament would like is still an issue. So this is when we get to what's called the Glorious Revolution. And it's called glorious because it's going to bring the English Bill of Rights, which you should add to the slide, to England without any bloodshed. And how they did this without any bloodshed is this. In the Netherlands, there was a woman named Mary who was part of the Stuart family, and she had married a Dutch guy named William of Orange. And the Parliament of Britain went to them and said, listen, we'll put you on the throne of England if you accept this English Bill of Rights. And they did, and so now Britain has a constitutional monarchy. The second constitutional government in Europe was the Dutch Republic, but it doesn't start this time period that way. It starts as being part of Spain, or controlled by Spain, which is in that larger Habsburg Empire. And so Philip II, the same Philip II with the Spanish Armada and who was interested in Elizabeth I, that Philip II controlled the Netherlands while the Netherlands was going through their own Reformation. And so the Dutch became Protestants, and this made Philip, this super Catholic, upset, and he tried to convert them back, and he did so by sending the Spanish Inquisition to the Netherlands. This does not go over well with the Dutch. The Dutch rebel further, and eventually they get to form their own government. And because they were sick of the kings like Philip II interfering in their lives, they created a republic. Now, if you remember your civics class, a republic means a representative government. Now, it's not like our representative government where everyone gets to vote and then we have representatives that represent all of us. This representative government was elected by nobles, but it was still a limited form of government. And so that is how the Dutch Republic became a constitutional government. Absolute monarchy is sort of a continuation of a trend that we've already mentioned earlier that happened in Europe in this time period, which were those new monarchs who started taking more power away from the nobles through taxes. But absolute monarchy adds more power to the kings. And the sort of idea behind absolute monarchy is something called the divine right of kings. And so it's basically the idea that we've talked about with other places where the king says, God picked me. And since God picked me, you have to do what I say, because if you don't, you're going against God. So that adds more power, more strength to these monarchs. And one of the first examples of absolute monarchy happened under the rule of Louis the 13th. Pretty much from now until there stops being kings in France, they're all named Louis. But who's more important than the king himself is the guy who designs the power structure, how to take power from the nobles. He is the one who really sets this idea of absolute monarchy ahead, and his name is Cardinal Richelieu. So Cardinal Richelieu, that's a French word. It creates this policy of things that stop the nobles, things like destroying their castles, which makes them angry. And if they're angry and they join with other nobles and have conspiracies, then he imprisons them. He also builds a bureaucracy that all leads back to the king. He also didn't like Calvinists very much. But the nobles are going to be really angry about his policies, and that's going to lead to a famous story being written. It's the story of the Three Musketeers. And in the Three Musketeers are nobles, and the bad guy in the story is Cardinal Richelieu, because he's always trying to take away all their power and he does bad things. And that's really how the nobles felt about him. Probably the best example of an absolute monarch is this guy, Louis the 14th. And let me just stop a moment and point out how you write his name in Roman numerals. In other words, the number 14. It's XIV. The reason this matters is because later in a later chapter, we're going to study also Louis the 16th, and because Roman numerals are awesome, 16 is XVI and 14 is XIV. So make sure you get that right. All right, back to why he's such an important absolute monarch. I mean, he thinks that he is the greatest king ever. He is all powerful. So much so that he calls himself the Sun King. Like he's as important as the sun is in the sky. And he has this famous quote where in French he says, L'état c'est moi, which means in English basically the state is me. I am France. So whatever I do, France does. And he kind of goes about doing his absolutism in a way that a couple other people do too, but he does it in spectacular fashion. And what he does is he builds this gigantic palace called Versailles. And like Tokugawa Ieyasu in Japan, or the next guy we're going to talk about, Peter the Great, he requires the nobles to come live there. But it's not a hard place to live. It is very large. It's the biggest building in all of Europe to that point. It's the largest private residence, I do believe, in the entire world when you take into account how much other land he has. They have gardens, they have a forest, plus the building itself. Here we have a drawing of the Palace of Versailles from around that time period, and you can just see how huge the building is, plus the grounds, and some of the 1,700 fountains.